angry crowd dragged a naked man through the streets of Boston. Tar hardened on his bare skin in the freezing cold, trapping the feathers against it, and there was nothing he could do about it. The worst of the night was still to come. No one watching needed to be told why the man was there. They knew who he was, and they knew that on this night, the law would have no say. A few hours earlier, it had been an ordinary street quarrel. One man, one cane, one boy who got in the way. John Malcolm raised his cane against a boy in a Boston street. A passing townsman named George Hughes stepped in to stop him. Malcolm turned on Hughes instead. He swung the cane and struck Hughes on the head. The blow opened a wound and knocked him to the ground. The blow did not end the quarrel. It started a bigger one. Malcolm went home. Hughes had his wound dressed, went before a magistrate, and had a warrant sworn out for Malcolm's arrest. When a constable came to serve it, he found the door barred and Malcolm refusing to come out. The constable left empty-handed. By evening, a large crowd had gathered outside the barricaded house. Malcolm stayed inside and refused to give himself up. The man behind that door was a Royal Customs officer. And in Boston, that one fact turned a street brawl into something far more dangerous. It was the night of January 25th, 1774. By then, resentment of the Crown no longer moved through petitions and courts alone. It had spilled into the streets, where crowds enforced their own justice. The men who collected the king's duties stood at the sharpest edge of a system the town was learning to hate. Customs enforcement was personal work. An officer boarded a ship, inspected its cargo, and seized whatever he judged unlawful, and every seizure struck at a particular merchant, a particular crew, a particular livelihood. The work made one man the visible face of a distant government. So when anger rose beyond the reach of the courts, it fell first on men like Malcolm. A great deal of scattered resentment had converged on a single figure behind a single door. The crowd had more than one reason to be there. The blow Hughes had taken that afternoon, the report that Malcolm had threatened a boy, his refusal to answer the warrant brought to his door, and beneath all of it lay a longer record of grievances against him, a customs officer whose seizures had made him enemies long before that winter day. The fresh brawl, the defiance of the law, and the old grudge drew together into a single crowd. The door gave way. The crowd forced its way in and hauled Malcolm out into the January cold. No court had authorized what came next. There was a warrant for his arrest, and a constable had already tried once to serve it. A few men urged the crowd to leave Malcolm to the law. Those who controlled it brushed them aside and decided for themselves. In the street, they stripped the clothes off him. Then came the tar, spread across his bare skin in the cold, and after the tar, the feathers, pressed into the sticky coating. The cold made the ordeal even crueler, and it was not over. This was only the beginning. The crowd did not leave the punishment where it began. A spectacle like this drew its power from an audience, so they dragged their prisoner through the streets toward a well-known landmark. It was the Liberty Tree, a great elm near the corner of Essex and Orange Streets in the South End. The tree had taken on its meaning in 1765, during the crisis over the Stamp Act. Back then, townspeople hung effigies of unpopular officials from its branches and gathered beneath it to vent their fury. From that point on, it served as an open-air stage, a place where the crowd imposed its will outside the courts. Beneath its branches, the town had learned to be a power in its own right, a power that answered to no governor. To be brought there was to be handed over to that power, and it judged for itself. No judge, no jury, no protection of the law. The march itself was part of the punishment. Every step drew more onlookers, swelling the crowd and turning a private grievance into a public spectacle. A customs officer, a man whose paperwork and seizures had made him an agent of empire, became, in a single evening, an exhibit dragged through the streets. But the crowd wanted more than a spectacle. At the Liberty Tree, they ordered Malcolm to give up his office and denounce the governor and the customs commissioners. He refused. They took him to the gallows, put a rope around his neck, and threatened to hang him. This was no longer just humiliation. Now they were using the threat of death to force him to submit. The rope did not break him at once. They hauled him around the town for hours, from the Liberty Tree to the gallows and back again, stop after stop, flogging him at each one. Only when they threatened to cut off his ears did Malcolm give in. He cursed the governor and promised to give up his office. Only then did they cart him back to his house and dump him at the door, half frozen, barely conscious. They did not hang him. He came away with his life, and nothing else. Malcolm did not stay silent about what had been done to him. 5 days after the attack, on January 30th, still confined to his bed, he dictated a sworn memorial. He laid it before the governor, the council, and the house, and under his own name and official title, he recorded what had happened that night: the stripping, the tar, the cold, and the threats. But his case did not end in Boston. When his frostbitten, tar-caked skin began to peel away in strips, he saved pieces of it in a box as proof of what he had suffered in the Crown service. He sailed with that box to London and petitioned the king for compensation. Newspapers, and later British prints, carried the image of his ordeal to readers who had never set foot in the town. Malcolm himself lived another 14 years in England. But the same weapon could easily be turned around. A little over a year after that night, it was the army itself that reached for tar and feathers in Boston, and this time, not against a customs officer, but against an ordinary colonist. Thomas Ditson was a young farmer from Billerica, a small town just north of Boston. He was 33, and he wanted one thing: to join the Minutemen. That was the name given to militiamen expected to be ready at a minute's notice whenever the alarm was raised. But for that, he needed a musket. So he left his fields and his family behind and, in early March of 1775, set out for occupied Boston to get himself one. In town, he asked around for anyone selling a gun. He was sent to a man who looked like a soldier, and was one. Sergeant John Clancy of the 47th Regiment led him to a house. It was not a private house. It was a barracks. Ditson counted out the money for a fine musket, and in that instant the soldiers seized him. According to Ditson, the sergeant told him, "Now I'll serve you the way you serve our men." Then they locked him in the guardhouse for the night. The two sides later told very different stories about what happened at that table. Ditson claimed the soldiers had offered him the musket themselves, then arrested him for the purchase. The soldiers claimed he had been after several weapons and had tried to persuade them to desert. All that is certain is that the next morning he was punished. On the morning of March 9th, a sergeant came into the guardhouse and ordered him to strip to the waist. Behind him, men carried a bucket of tar and a pillowcase stuffed with feathers. An officer in the doorway simply gave a nod, and the soldiers coated him in tar from head to breeches and covered him in feathers. Then they read a placard aloud and hung it around his neck. It called him a villain who had tried to entice one of His Majesty's soldiers to desert and take up arms with the rebels against his king. They set him on a chair fixed to a two-wheeled cart. Some 40 to 50 soldiers, armed with muskets and fixed bayonets, closed in around him. Led by Colonel Nesbitt, they pushed him out into the streets. They wheeled him through the center of Boston, past the old State House, past the Liberty Tree. The fifes and drums first struck up a mocking march, and then Yankee Doodle. The soldiers had set their own verse to the tune. Yankee Doodle came to town for to buy a firelock. We will tar and feather him, and so we will John Hancock. It was mockery thrown straight in the town's face. But the people of Boston began to press in around the procession. They saw soldiers dragging one of their own, and they pushed closer and closer. Nesbitt gave the order to halt and load. He realized that a single spark could turn this into a second massacre, like the one 5 years before on this very street. He thought better of it and ended the procession. Then they let Ditson go and told him to head home. They had not broken him. He went back to Billerica. A few weeks later, word of the fighting at Lexington and Concord swept across the countryside, and he took up a musket as a Minuteman. He had become exactly what he had gone to Boston intending to be. The army had wanted to make an example of him. Instead, it made him a soldier. By nightfall, Malcolm's cane, the one he had raised that afternoon in a Boston street, was useless against the crowd at his door. Together, the two episodes left the town with a question it could not yet answer. Both the street and the regiment had learned to punish without a court, and neither would surrender that power easily. In a season when law was steadily giving way to force, no one in Boston could say where the line between popular justice and plain terror would finally be drawn.